makes you feel different from those around you? Is it your age, your gender, your race, a disability? Most of us have aspects of our identity that make us feel different and often less than those around us. This can lead us to feel the need to prove ourselves to others, which can be exhausting and unfulfilling. This week, I speak with Shirag Shemmassian, who helps students get into universities, graduate schools, etc. I'm very grateful to Shirag for his willingness to talk with me about the challenges of growing up with Tourette Syndrome and the ways in which that caused him to doubt himself. We also talk about the unintended consequences of messages we get from our parents and what we can do to better manage imposter syndrome and better support those around us. Thanks so much for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Menninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help women and others overcome imposter syndrome and advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest to share how they've navigated self-doubt to achieve success. The more we share our stories, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us. Thank you so much for listening and sharing. Welcome, Shirag. I am very excited to have this conversation with you. I know you and I have just started talking before I hit the record button, and I can't wait to continue. Before we do, though, I'd love to invite you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Shirag Shemmassian. I'm the founder and CEO of Shemmassian Academic Consulting, where we primarily help students get into medical school in the US and Canada and elsewhere at times, as well as, top colleges and graduate programs. And it's something I've been doing for nearly 20 years and really enjoy just helping our students achieve their academic and career goals, because the landscape is always changing, always in the direction of becoming more difficult. And, it's my job to help students sort of put their best foot forward.
And have you been doing this throughout your career, or did you have any twists and turns in getting to where you are today?
Oh, yeah. I think that twists and turns have been the rule rather than the exception for me. A lot of people I speak with, actually, when you talk about how they landed in their careers, it's very rare that people are like, yep, I've always known I want to do X and that's how it turned out, and all that good stuff, even within a field, right? So there are even people who are like physicians or something like that, where, they might think that they're going to do a certain specialty and then they make a twist and all that kind of stuff. But to answer your question more directly about me, certainly I, was in college all 4 years, pre-med, at Cornell. I had done very well in school and was ready to apply to medical school. So my first sort of twist and turn was I actually ended up doing my PhD in clinical psychology instead. And a lot of that was driven by me having a personal interest in mental health and brain development as someone who grew up with Tourette syndrome. But I was also doing a lot of work sort of in mental health, both on the research side and clinically and service-wise. And so I think all roads were sort of leading me down this different path. And it took a minute until I sort of came to terms with that. And so I went into that. And even from there, was thinking initially I might want to go into academia, be a professor or chancellor of a school or whatever the case might be. And over time, as my sort of interest changed, towards, test development and clinical work and admissions. And this was something that I was doing the whole time, all through college and grad school and beyond. And it was sort of a flame that continued to grow. And sort of the final twist and turn was essentially coming to doing this work full time. And that's probably been one of the best career decisions that I've made, if not the best career decision that I've made. And I'm just really happy to be here. And yeah, it's an exciting time to do this work for sure.
Well, I would imagine that your psychology background serves you well in this work as well. So it's not entirely discrete from what you've been doing, but probably.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And it comes up in so many different ways, from, you might not think about it, but even the way that you produce content online, whether it's a blog or YouTube video or whatever, in terms of how to engage people, how to demonstrate an understanding of what it is that they might be concerned about at that time, what information they're looking for, and how to, help them best digest it. That certainly comes up. absolutely. I mean, it's an anxiety inducing process. Admissions is terribly nerve wracking, and making sure to be able to hold that for our students, I think, is a very important thing. But then just inherent to what we do, I mean, there's an admissions committee on the other side of it, and they're evaluating your essays and learning more about you. So the way you frame your background and what it is that an admissions committee member learns about you is incredibly important and impacts your odds of getting into school. So you're absolutely right, Kim, that it sort of pervades everything that we do.
That's great. And tell me, if you're open to this, anything about your own personal connection to the topic of imposter syndrome. Is that something that you have felt at any point in your own life?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a big part of my life. Going back to mentioning that I grew up with Tourette syndrome. So around age 8 or age 9, I started, exhibiting verbal and, some actually mostly motor tics. So like, shoulder shrugs, facial grimaces, things like that. And then sometimes I had little vocal tics like, or clearing my throat or something like that. So nothing ever significant like cursing, uncontrollably, or sort of the stereotypes that you hear, which is a very rare symptom, by the way. But in any case, there were a lot of people along the way, whether teachers or other people who, would say, you're not gonna, like, you just have a bad habit, you're making excuses, you're not gonna get anywhere. And like, I heard this kind of stuff throughout junior high and throughout high school. And, there was no reason to believe, like, I was always good in school and all that kind of stuff. There was no reason to believe that I couldn't, achieve just as much as everybody else unless I bought into that story. But, if I'm being honest, that stuff stays with you, when people, cast doubt or question or whatever the case might be, sort of, there's a fire and you're upset about it and you're like, well, I'll show them. But then there's always a voice inside of you that's like, are they right? Like, am I at a disadvantage? Am I gonna, achieve less than my peers or whatever the case might be? And so, throughout my education, I always wondered, if that was going to be the case. But then even when I was able to get into some great schools, Kim, there's always the question of, am I getting in because, I wrote about this thing and they're taking pity? That kind of thing was always sort of in the back of my mind, and wondering, okay, yeah, but I know I've done well to this point, but when I get to the next stage, am I going to do well? And the next stage, or even when I was assisting students with this process, and then when I, turned it into an actual, company, there was the question of, yeah, I mean, it's one thing to do it like sort of on the side, but once I go full time, they're going to see X, Y, and there was no support behind the concerns. Let me be clear. Like, there was no evidence, that I wasn't, good enough in school or at my job, or that, if I decided to put more focused effort into this work, that then it would go, like, there was literally no reason to believe that. But there were those doubts for sure. And I think that's a natural part of everything that we do, and right now we're developing new programs in the digital space that we never had before. That's not something I've done before. There's still imposter syndrome about that. So I've just come, I don't know if embrace is the right word. It's not like, yay, imposter syndrome. It's not like that, but it's more so an understanding of this is life and this is a thing that you experience. And I think the important thing is, what do you do in response? Do you let that take over and do you shut down and not do anything? Or do you say, it is what it is, I hear it, and I'm moving forward? And I think I've done a pretty good job of taking that latter path, rather than, say, that's probably true, I'm not going to do what my dream is or whatever. And unfortunately, I do see a lot of people, with that, whether they're looking to start a business or doing something different. A lot of it's like, well, yeah, but I have this response. You don't understand. My situation is different, and all this kind of stuff. And I think imposter syndrome sort of leads us to develop, in our head, those barriers for why not to do something we're really passionate about.
Well, you hit on some really important things there in terms of telling us a little bit about the arc of your story. And I think, the key themes that really struck me were being a child and feeling different and getting that kind of feedback from teachers who when you're that age, you trust, right? You don't have the ability to take in that feedback in a nuanced way and question whether they have right training or, perspective.
Nope.
And so that's got to be really hard to fight that kind of self-doubt. And then that piece you mentioned about, and I just characterized it in my mind as the legitimacy question, because this is something that I see so often, particularly among women, people of color, anybody who feels like there's any possibility that the reason they are there is because of their diversity status and not because of their actual accomplishments and strengths. And so I'm curious, I love the way you summed it up as this is life, but it must have been hard at various points to maintain that mindset. Were there things that you did consciously to try to stay away from some of the more negative chatter that could have potentially derailed your path?
Consciously is an interesting, going back to what you said about, certainly for women and people of color and all this kind of stuff. And, my parents are immigrants to this country, and, they went to school elsewhere. They went to school in the Middle East before they moved here. And then also, we grew up very, very middle class. Like both my parents are teachers, and so they sort of grew up, in this country with a mindset of like, go to school, get a job with benefits, be safe, be secure. Like their inclination was always towards that. Right. And I think that part of it was always, trying to get my brother and me to a place where we would be fine. There wasn't really a discussion ever of it could be more than fine. There's something even beyond fine. Like that was never brought up. And so, I remember distinctly when I first started having, Tourette syndrome symptoms, my dad was like, just stop doing that. What are people going to think of us? Or what are they going to think of you when you're doing? They're going to think you're different. They're going to think you're, and I recognize this is not a PC word today, but it's a quote. He said, they're going to think you're retarded. And this was, look, I'm going back to the 90s where that word was more used. It's a terrible word, of course, but that was the thinking of like, you're going to be seen different to the point of, people maybe not offering you the same opportunities. That's going to impact your ability to become secure and all this kind of stuff. And even when I got into like Cornell for undergrad, I remember again, a question from my dad being, that's great. But are you sure you can make it there? Those schools aren't for people like us. That's a literal quote. So when you said the bit about, women and, people of color feeling like they don't belong or they're just there to fill some, that wasn't just like a made up thought in my, like those were words actually communicated to me and from someone who loves me and I love it, that all that kind of stuff. But of course, and that's something that was verbalized to me. And absolutely, I wonder that, like, was I there for this reason, for that reason, or for whatever. But fortunately, I've been able to show myself and others that at every stage I've been able to succeed at, really high levels. I think for me, it wasn't something conscious of like, this is what I'm going to do or whatever the case might be. I think for me, there was always, if I'm going to be completely honest, Kim, there was always a little bit of anger there, right? When I heard that kind of thing from my dad or from a teacher or whatever the case might be about like, you watch,
I'll show you.
You wait and see. I'll show you. That's absolutely true of me. Sometimes you hear this thing of like the best way to tell me or the best way to get me to do something is tell me I can't. Like that very much applies to me. That's sort of my personality. And I think there's good to that. I think there's also bad to that, because the good is, boy, like you say, I can't, or you question it, I'll do it. That's a great thing to have fire about. I think the downside to that for me, and something that I reflect on more and more, is thinking about how, all right, well, at what point does it become not beneficial? Mm-hmm. If I'm doing it primarily to prove so and so wrong, when, if and when I achieve that thing, is my satisfaction going to be fleeting? Because that person doesn't care. The same thing, the imposter voice in your head doesn't care. They're just there to plant seeds of doubt, like just because that's what it does. It's it's not helpful, right? But you have to find that more intrinsic motivation. Like the goal shouldn't be just to show everyone else you're not an imposter. It's to say I have a goal and this is why I want to achieve it, and I'm going to do it in spite of getting the chatter from my family, from my friends, from peers, from teachers, from my own head, right? That's what I think is the most important thing. And I think where a lot of high achievers have to grow, to find that intrinsic motivation rather than relying on, showing others or showing the world or to get some external kind of validation, because that stuff is so fleeting. It's remarkable.
That is such a great point. I'm taking notes as we're talking because you're bringing up so many great points. I think that a lot of us feel, whether it's directly in response to the kind of feedback that you're describing, that we're going to show so-and-so, right? Or just this general sense that because of who we are or how we feel in a particular environment, that we have to prove ourselves in ways that perhaps others don't. And you bring up such a good point about the fact that when you actually achieve that goal of proving yourself or doing what others think you can't, what's the payoff, right? Do you actually feel a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment, or do you just move on to the next thing that you feel like you need to prove, right? So would you say, given the choices that you've made in your career, that you have reached a point where your choices are your own now and not necessarily guided by the need to prove yourself?
It's both. I mean, I think that it's both. And I don't know, look, maybe I'm being naive. I don't know that it will ever stop being both. Maybe, as I become wiser, that's the goal, and, care less and less about those kinds of things. But I think this is a true sort of work in progress situation because, when you have this sort of imposter syndrome, impacting you or wondering whether you belong or why you're in this space that you are. Like I said, whether you're a woman or a person of color or someone with a disability or you're an immigrant or whatever the case might be, there's always going to be that doubt. And there is a pressure, right? Like, it's hard. Like when you're in that space, now there's a pressure to not just be like pretty good. You almost like have to be great to show like, yes, their decision, the admissions committee's decision was justified. My decision to start the business. Whereas like people who might not have that chip on their shoulder, or whatever, I think there's like, well, if you're average, you're average or something. But, for someone like me, it's like, it's not okay to be that. At least that's been sort of the chatter in my head. And so there is a push always. But I also, Kim, do feel a sense of responsibility to other people. I mean, because just the work that I do, I mean, two things. Number one, the students and the families we serve, they're putting an enormous amount of trust, in me and, in our team to help them get into great schools and all that kind of stuff. So, I can't be average in my work or whatever because I owe it to them. And, their expectations are important, not because that's their expectation, but because I have that expectation of myself to deliver at that level because, my parents couldn't afford the service I offer today. And I have to do right by people, and that's something where, heck, if that fire is there because it allows us to help deliver that result for our families, then great. I want that fire to be there. But then the other thing is, I owe it to, other kids who are growing up and they might have a difference, whether it's, they have Tourette syndrome or autism or something different or dyslexia or they're a person of color or an immigrant or whatever the case might be. We always talk about needing role models and examples and stuff like that, where you want to see someone like you who was able to achieve X, Y, and Z. Well, having the skill and the talent to do something, I think you owe it to the folks who might eventually look up to you or might not have those examples, to be great. If you're a person of color with a certain skill, I think you should push yourself to achieve at a great level to show others that it's doable and to motivate and inspire. I think that's important. So I guess I don't think of decisions just as like this is my decision. This is what I want to do because I want to do it and it's good for me. I just don't think that way. I think it's much more communal in the sense that like, I want to do well because I know that's what I want and it's good for me and to show others, but also, the sort of loving way to show others that it's possible who might not believe it is. And so I don't see it just as a self, like just for me. That's just not how I view the world and my work. So I'll leave it there.
Well, and that strikes me as a healthier form of pressure than coming from a place of anger, as you were describing previously, right? So the idea of, I'm going to hold myself to a high standard of excellence because I want to be able to deliver on the promise of my business, or I want to be a good role model for others. That seems to come from a place of, I'm trying to think, it's not coming from a place of, I need to prove myself because others don't think I can do it, but because I want to be my best self in service of a higher mission. So I wonder if that feels to you like a different experience than when you were feeling more so like, I'm going to show you that I can do it.
It is. And when I was younger, it was much more about, I'm going to show you and all this kind of stuff. I don't think I had the same perspective about what it meant to, inspire. Like when you're 16, 17, look, there are certainly others out there who will have this, but, I can't say that I was at a place where I was thinking about inspiring, future generations for, people who might have, similar backgrounds to me or anything like that. As I've grown up, I've seen that, I've taken that more seriously, that expectation of myself to do that. And it's and so this is why I'm excited sort of how this evolves for me, as far as maybe the motivation down the line becomes almost not at all driven by the I'll show you or the anger kind of piece. And that will sort of dissipate and it'll come to an even more healthy place where it is for the community and to show my son, I have a 3-year-old and a second on the way, and, to show them what's doable, and to show other members of like the Armenian community or the Middle Eastern community or kids with disabilities or kids whose parents were immigrants or immigrants and stuff. All these kinds of things are very important to me. And it's something that, I take very seriously now.
So I'm curious too about the influence that parents have in their messages, because I'm going to assume that your dad, in the messages that he gave to you, was well-intentioned, right? And didn't understand.
I assume. Yeah.
Didn't understand necessarily the potential implications of that message. How do you think about that today, knowing what you know now? Because obviously you can see the world differently. And How does that influence how you think about the messages that you send to your own children?
Huge. It's actually something that I was talking to my wife about recently. It's incredible how early this stuff starts. Like I said, I have a 3-year-old son, and sometimes has these trucks and a piece comes off and he's trying to put it back and he's frustrated. And, recently he was saying, I can't, like it was at the breakfast table. And I just stood there. I think he was expecting me to jump in, and then I could see that like it wasn't broken or anything. And he was, and then he did it. And then I said, you did it. Of course you can. And he said, I can. And that was really sweet to me, because it's interesting, what our behaviors, not just what we say, but also what we do, right? Jumping in too early, not letting, someone struggle, and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that teaches the right messages. And so even, whether I'm doing work in admissions where if someone's like, I feel stuck, could you edit? And just not putting their best foot forward as far as producing their best work or whatever the case might be. I think that, when we don't experience any roadblocks or failures or all that kind of stuff, I think that makes us more susceptible to these kinds of issues, because you've never experienced something difficult. Well, then when you do eventually and inevitably, face something, you're not going to know how to deal with it. And you might then not try, or you might try and it not work out. And you say, see, I was right. And now if you don't have any foundation, and now you experience that as a 25, 30, 35-year-old, it might be a little bit unsettling and lead you to buy into the story that you can't. And so to me, it's important that, we communicate to our kids that they're capable of doing all sorts of different things, and also to model that in our behavior. If they're seeing us struggle, I want them to also see us sticking with it, or if they're struggling with something, for us to not jump in, because I think those things actually matter. I mean, I see it again, even with such a young child, I see it all the time.
That's such a great point. And I'm curious, because of the work you do, you probably have a lot of access to parents and messaging. But, we hear a lot stereotypically about younger generations not having the same opportunity to fail, or the helicopter parents who are right there to pick up their children when they fall. Do you see that in the work that you're doing? That must be something that comes through as you're
all the time. all the time. And it's especially true like during the high school years, where there's an expectation to go to a certain college and all that kind of stuff. The kids are at home, they go to school, there's homework every day, there's all this kind of, management and stuff like that. And then over time, I see that it goes down, right, as people go away for college and they're doing a little bit more independent work and all that kind of stuff. But there are absolutely parents who are very involved, even when their kids are 20, 21, mid 20s, all that kind of stuff. And, asking for updates and, being on calls and all this kind of stuff. And I wonder also what that communicates to students, making sure that, everything is taken care of and handled, and there's like little room to stumble and whatnot. And I don't think that that's necessarily resilience building. Of course, there are cultural elements to this, right? Like parents from certain cultural backgrounds are going to be, on average, a little bit more involved maybe, or have come from more collectivist background, all that kind of stuff. But I always want to be mindful of what students are hearing. Because a lot of times, even when our students achieve at a high level, I get a lot of, but, I don't know, I'm an Asian male and it's not going to be good enough. Or, but this school actually admits more women, so this isn't going to be good enough, and all this kind of stuff. It's before they even apply and try. There's this idea that like, yes, I'm doing all this great stuff, but I don't know, it's going to be like, it's not going to be enough. And so I'm feeling kind of defeated, all this kind of stuff. But we have to be mindful of what stories are real and what we're buying into that doesn't necessarily serve us well. And to make sure that we're getting the kind of support that uplifts us and encourages us to keep going, rather than think, but, and sort of downplaying our achievement, because that's also, not going to be valuable to you.
So that sounds like a really great action step too, for anybody who may be identifying with this conversation, is to pay attention to that story that they're telling themselves, and to notice that language of, but, the dismissing of their strengths, talking themselves out of things. Is that a recommendation you would have for people as they think about their own experience with imposter syndrome?
Be mindful of the language you're using, both, speaking out loud, but also internally. There was a book years ago I read that distinguished facts and opinions. A lot of times what we say about ourselves or think about ourselves, we say as a matter of fact, but it's not good enough. That's an opinion. That's not a fact. But we say it and buy into it like it is. A fact is it's 73 degrees outside, or whatever the temperature is. I know that's a great achievement, but as an Asian female, that's not going to be good enough. It's said like a fact. That's not going to be good enough, but that's an opinion statement. And I think we have to distinguish that, right? Because if we buy into things like they're fact, well, that's really defeating. And I want to make sure that our students are appropriately being challenged when they're taking opinions to be fact.
I think that is such an important point, because we can convince ourselves that our story is fact very easily, but we don't necessarily take as much time to examine and challenge those stories. And partly that's a function of the fact that we're busy and we're thinking about a lot of things at once. But I do think that slowing down and really paying attention to what you're telling yourself and asking yourself, is this fact or is this opinion, is a great strategy.
Yeah. Glad we could leave people with that. Go ahead, Kim.
I know that you get involved with this level, but I'm just curious because it occurred to me that given what we're talking about in terms of challenging mindsets and maybe different experiences in the younger generations, is there anything that you think that those of us who may be managing or supporting people who have that mindset could do differently from a support perspective? Like, if we know that that's their experience, do we show up any differently?
I mean, the challenging doesn't just come from the person speaking the, opinion as fact statement, right? It also comes from us. I often say, I was talking to a student earlier today, and they're like, well, yeah, I know I got this score, but X, Y, and Z. And, I was like, all right, let me, ask some questions around this. And I was starting to ask questions around, well, how about this about your profile? How about this? And they're like, well, that's really good. That's really good. And I was like, oh, so where is the evidence that they're like, you're right, this was really helpful, whatever. So I'm not just saying like, oh, just, people take this and, stop your internal trial. I think it's incumbent upon us as, just helping professionals to challenge that in the people that we serve. And it's not just to get them to change their mind, because I actually believe, like, if people believe something is possible, they're going to behave differently than if they don't believe that it's possible. If you really buy, like in my line of work, if you actually believe, however tough it is, if you actually believe there is a chance of getting into, let's call it Stanford Medical School or whatever, you're going to behave differently and put in a different kind of effort than if you believe if there is no chance. Whether it's conscious or subconscious, probably subconscious, that's a different story, but it is going to impact things. Same things for people, like if you're a business coach or something like that. Your client might be like, oh, I have this idea and I want this thing, and only if I had childcare, I could. If they actually don't believe that they're going to succeed, they'll come up with every reason. They won't put in the right effort, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's incumbent upon folks, who do the type of work that I do and in similar spaces, to challenge that in the people that they serve, because it's good for them. And I think that it's going to help them overcome some of the barriers that they may or may not know they have.
I love that perspective so much, because I do agree that it's an internal and an external effort, that we certainly have the opportunity as individuals to challenge our own thinking. But going back to things you said previously about being more service oriented, that's how we can really support each other as well. And I believe that it benefits us, to your point too. I mean, we all feel better when we feel like we're helping others. And I know that I have never been more confident than doing work helping other people feel confident, right?
Sure.
So we learn from our own experiences of helping others as well.
Absolutely. And seeing the change in them, I think, can also, change your perspective and give you the tools to serve others based on what works.
Absolutely. So I could talk to you all day. This has been such a fascinating conversation, but in the interest of time, I'd love to share where people can find you. If anyone wants to hear more from you, how can they connect?
Yeah, thanks for the platform and the opportunity, Kim. It's been a treat for me as well. But as far as getting in touch, our website is shemmassianconsulting.com. It's a little bit of a mouthful. And so I'm sure you'll link to it in the show notes. But going back to Impostor, I have no formal business training when I started my organization. And that's another thing that fortunately I didn't buy into. Oh, I need to go to business school to do something like this. But yeah, people can go to the website, and in the top right corner, there's a contact button, and folks can get in touch pretty easily. And if there's anything I can do to assist them with education or otherwise, it would be a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much, Shirag. It's been such a pleasure talking to you today.
Likewise.
I will absolutely link to that in the show notes, and I'm just very grateful for your insights.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Kim.
Thank you for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you're listening to this, chances are you struggle with imposter syndrome or other confidence issues too. Please know that you are in great company. As an executive coach and former high-tech leader, I spent years battling imposter syndrome. There were times in my corporate life when I was absolutely sure that this was the moment that everyone would figure out that I didn't belong in the room. But it never happened. And through the years, with the help of research, coaching, and other resources, I've learned to help myself and others overcome self-doubt and advance our careers with strength and confidence. If you'd like to continue this conversation, please join my Leading Women Facebook group, where women of diverse roles, levels, and backgrounds come together to ask questions, share challenges, and support one another in a safe, trusted space that's difficult to find in the workplace. Check out the link in the show notes for more information on how to find us. And please join us again next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.